Welcome back. We're on component 6 in chapter 8. We're going to talk about what the book described as recessionary and or inflationary gaps. And what happens typically is the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve determine equilibrium price levels and real GDP in the short run. And at that point, then forces either through activities by policymakers or just natural forces within the economy start to drive, in the short run, try to drive everything back to equilibrium in the long run. And sticky wages, other price, stickiness is going to determine how long it takes to get the economy back to potential output and to equilibrium price level and real GDP. And during these times in the short run, actual output can either be above or below the potential output level. If output is greater than the potential output level, if employment is above the natural level of employment, or you can look at it as below the natural rate of unemployment, then we're in what is considered a inflationary gap, and we're actually operating, the economy is actually operating in the short run to the right side of that long run aggregate supply curve. Remember, that thing is vertical, and so we're in this, I don't want to say no man's land, but we're in this area to the right of that long run average supply curve. Now, if you take the flip side and actual output is below the potential level of output, if employment is below the natural level of employment, or you can look at it again, above the natural rate of unemployment, then we're working over here on the left-hand, in this area to the left-hand side of the long-run aggregate supply curve, and that's called a recessionary gap. And so if you think about it, to the left of the long-run average supply curve is, again, recessionary gap. To the right of that's going to be an inflationary gap. And if you just kind of in your mind, just always remember that, it's a little easier to kind of work through these recessionary and inflationary gaps. And really, in the short run, as it moves to the long run, it's going through these groupings of shocks and adjustments. The aggregate demand, it makes a movement either up or down, left or right, depending on how you want to look at it. It either expands or contracts, depends on what terminology you want to use on aggregate demand, and it's usually in response to one of the drivers of aggregate demand. Again, go back to consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports, and that is shifting that aggregate demand. Now, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in response to changes in the prices of factors of production. Again, labor, capital stock, natural resources. That's going to shift that short-run aggregate supply curve. And again, it's focused on that shift, the magnitude and the direction of that shift, not only on the prices of factors production, but also the quantity and quality of your factors of production, the technology you have available in the economy at that given time, and the entrepreneurial capability that's driving and then managing that technology piece. If operating at if the economy is operating at its potential, that's where you get, the aggregate demand. It's called a demand shock. You end up in an inflationary gap. Short run aggregate supply, it's considered a supply shock, and you're in a recessionary gap. Remember, recessionary gap to the left-hand side of the long run aggregate supply curve. The inflationary gap we're setting over here on the right-hand side of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So one of them is driven by aggregate demand shock. The other one's driven by a short-run aggregate supply shock. And they again, the book talks about just the demand shock, what happens to the demand shock. Typically, that demand shock, again, it's something that impacts one of your four components that drives that aggregate demand curve. In a lot of instances, it ends up in this inflationary gap. Prices increase. The real GDP, stays at that level. And what happens at that point as prices increase, remember, go back to omega, as prices increase, what happens to that real wage rate? Nominal wage rate divided by the price level, and that's your omega that we talked about in the chapter on employment. And think about what that's going to do with prices. That's going to drive inflation. If you look at kind of the other shock to it, and we're talking about a supply shock, you're talking about a recessionary gap, it's going to be an impact to the factors of production. In the demand, it's the wages are slow to impact, slow to respond. In kind of the recessionary, it's, you're talking about some prices that are slow to respond. You've got impacts on the price level, you've got impacts on, unemployment, you end up in that recessionary gap. And so depending on whether the economy is suffering from a demand shock and an inflationary gap, or a supply shock where that short run average supply curve is moving, and that's your recessionary, gap. Depending on which gap that the economy is sitting in at any given time, that's the conundrum that we talk about that, the policymakers are faced with. And when you talk about gaps in, public policy, what do? Do they sit back and wait for what's called self-correction? Do they think the economy and the forces within the economy will eventually drive the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curve, drive it back to long-run equilibrium? And it takes a while for the economy to do that, because it's the inflationary and recessionary gaps are really dependent on how inflexible prices and wages are, how sticky prices and wages are. So how do they get back to that long run? And remember, earlier in a couple of sections ago, talked about John Maynard Keynes and, his comment on the long run, when he said in the long run, we're going to all be dead anyway. So basically, can the consumer, can society wait for the economy to self-correct themselves? And so you've got policymakers looking at, is the economy, is it too sluggish? Is the economy too hot and expanding too fast? And I've got inflation. Is it sluggish? And, is it moving too slow? And, you sure don't want it to get into a situation where you've got, as we talked about in the price level chapter, and, we're talking about inflation. You don't want it to get in that situation where you've got prices rising and the economy slowing down. And that's where you get into stagflation. And the policymakers really don't want stagflation. We also talked about with some of these demand shocks and some of the supply shocks, you're talking about demand pull inflation. You're talking about cost push inflation. And so from the perspective of the policymakers and, government, whether it's state, federal, local government, they're all trying to figure out what to do. And so, the two options are, we just don't do anything and we let the economy take care of it. Or we jump in and we try to take, and, if we think the economy is too hot and you've got, inflationary gap, do you do some kind of a contractionary policy to kind of slow it down. If you think you're in a recession, do you try to jumpstart it with an expansion policy? And so policymakers are trying to figure out how to alter the situation between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. And basically, they typically talk about stabilization policy, which it's either the government or the central bank. And we talked about how the more independence you had between the government and the central bank, the better off you were if you're trying to manage some kind of stabilization policy. And there are some instances where the government and the central bank's the same thing, and that's where you get hyperinflation. And it's really difficult at that point to manage some of the shocks you get, whether it's a demand shock or supply shock. So you're looking at stabilization policy, and they can either take the fiscal policy route, where the government increases government purchases, it does some transfer payments, maybe they play around with the taxes, maybe they play around with corporate tax rates, the personal income tax rate, maybe they do some tax rebates, or they can look at monetary policy and use the central bank to influence the level of economic activity. And so the Federal Reserve, that's what they've been doing for the last, I don't know, it's been over a year since they started playing around with interest rates. So Federal Reserve's been, as our central bank here in the United States, they've been tinkering with interest rates, trying to get inflation. They're trying to get inflation to slow down and come back down to a reasonable level. But at the same time, they don't want to slow down the economy. They want the economy to still grow. They're just trying to get the price level under control. So where the rub comes in for the policymaker is, at what point do they step in? And at some points they step in too quickly, and they implement either fiscal or monetary policy, and it actually makes the situation worse. Or it ends up with a situation where they would have been better off just to let the economy try to self-correct itself. So that's where we're going to stop with Chapter 8. We're going to leave it up to our experts in Washington to try to figure out how to keep the economy plugging along here in 2023, trying to keep inflation rates under control. And that's going to wind us up with Chapter 8. And we'll look forward to jumping into Chapter 9 in the near future, and hope everybody is enjoying the rest of your evening. Thank you.